Hey everyone, Tyler here. I'm a cloud security engineer, and today I'm going to show you how to get started with the AWS CLI. So let's get into it. Now, the AWS CLI right here, this is basically a tool that allows us to interact with our resources in AWS. So we can create, read, update, and delete those resources. It's a great way for quickly automating our tasks as well. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to set up a IAM user, which I've already created in my account. So we'll do this with AWS configure here. And then let me copy over the credentials. Now I'm showing you these credentials to show you how to set this up, but these are not something that you would want to expose in your own environment. And then I'm going to delete this user afterwards as well. So we can specify a default region, which means every time we run the AWS commands, different resources in AWS are region-based. So for example, EC2, S3, EKS, if you're running commands against those, you'll have to specify a region. And so what we can do is we can specify a default region, meaning if we forget or don't specify the region, it'll know, okay, I'm going to check in the default region. So I just like to stick with US East 1, and then the default output format, I just put JSON. All right, so once we have those configured, we can run this command here. And this is basically asking AWS, hey, who are we? So we can see that we are the user, and we can see the account that we're in, and then we can see the user ID as well. And then you might be wondering, okay, well, where does this get stored? How does it authenticate? You know, I passed in the credentials. Where does it go? And so if we look in our roots, the home directory here under .aws, so dot means it's a hidden directory. If we look under there, we have two files. So let's go ahead and we can do nano, and then we can go into the config file. So we can see default. Now default just means default profile because we didn't specify a profile when we set up our credentials. I'm going to show you how to do that later on. And then we also have the region that we put in there. We also said JSON. So just some, it keeps track of that. We'll exit out here, and then we can go into this other file, credentials, and we can see our access keys. So these access keys are in plain text on the system when you set it up. So it's just something to be aware of. All right, I'm going to exit out. We'll clear the screen there. Now we're going to go into how to view our IAM user policies. So what we'll do here is we'll do AWS, and then we can do IAM, and then list user. Sometimes it auto-completes, sometimes it doesn't. We can just do tab. We can hit the tab key, and it should be able to auto-complete. Dash dash, and then it'll be username, and then our username was user. So we can see that, okay, I've got one policy attached. So this command here specifically actually looks for inline policies. So inline policies are policies that you can create and attach to your identities, whether it's a user or a role. And this policy is specific to that identity. In this case, it's specific to the user called user. And we can go ahead and look at this policy. So essentially, we're going to read it. Get user policy, specify the username again, and then the policy name up here, which was describe EC2 details. Just copy that, paste, and we can actually read what this policy gives us permissions to do. So we can do EC2 describe addresses, describe account attributes, some other commands there on all resources. So what this means is basically I could just run AWS EC2, and then I could do describe addresses. Now I don't have any EC2s running, so this won't return anything. Yep, blank there. But if I wanted to try to do something else, like, okay, let's describe, let's see, VPC, I mean, any of these would work, VPCs. I'm going to be unable to do so because my policy, at least this policy, doesn't provide the permissions to do so. All right, so those are inline policies, and that's how we read them. I'm going to clear the screen, and we can look at manage policies as well. List attached user policies to the username user, and then hit enter. All right, so now we have attached policies. Now attached policies can either be an out-of-the-box AWS policy, one that AWS has created, or it's a policy that we've created ourselves and we can attach that policy to multiple users or roles. So in this case, this is actually a AWS managed policy, right? But we can read it. So we can do IAM get policy, and then we'll put the policy RN in here. And then this is going to show us what version of the policy it is and a couple other details. Yeah, so we can see the policy name, policy ID, right? Default version ID is v4. So we know that there's at least 4 versions of this policy, which means every time the policy gets updated, it has a new version to it. And then we can actually look at get policy version. I'm going to paste the RN in there again, and then we can actually look at specific versions of that policy. Version ID, and in this case, v4, that's the default policy, so we can look at that and see what permissions we have. Okay, so we have these. But what if we want to look at v1? Well, we can look at the first version of this policy. So when AWS first came out with this policy, this is what it looked like. List star, get star, etc. All right, so that is IAM users and how we can look at the permissions that we have. The next thing we're going to do is set up a IAM role and assume that role. So in my account, I have a user and I have a role, and I've allowed a user to assume the role. And so what that means is essentially the role may grant additional privileges that the user doesn't have. Now, when the user assumes that role, they get credentials for that role, and then they can perform whatever actions that role allows them to do. So one thing, let's see, it's actually STS assume role, and then I've got the role ARN here. So I named the role, and then the role session name, we'll just do example. That could be anything. Really, the only thing that this affects is when you look at logs of who performed actions, you're going to see assumed role, example, and that'll show up in the logs there. So one thing I want to talk about, and we'll see this, move my picture here. All right, so this acts a little bit differently than an IAM user. With the IAM user, we had those credentials that we hard-coded and we put into our configuration file. But with a role, we'll have an access key ID like we did before. We have a secret access key like we did before. But now we have this session token. Now, this is the key distinction between a user and role, at least when it comes to credentials. And when I interview people for like cloud security positions or just general security positions, a lot of people don't understand the difference in credentials between a user and a role. So just keep this in mind in case you ever get asked for it. Essentially, with a role, we have temporary credentials. That's the session token. All right, so this token is only good in this case for I think like an hour. So the default is an hour, and then you can bump it up to, I believe, 12 hours is the max. All right, so now that we have this, let's set this up. Let's actually use the credentials. So I'm going to show you this here, and we're going to just set up the role. AWS configure, and then we're going to change the access key here to the roles access key, and then we're going to grab the secret access key ID, and then we'll keep the region, we'll keep the output. All right, so let's see what happens when we do STS get caller identity. All right, we're going to get this error message, and this error message indicates that the security token included in the request is invalid. Well, that security token it's referring to is actually this session token. So what we need to do actually when we set up a role is run a slightly different command. So we'll do AWS configure, and then we will do set AWS _ session token. just like that, and we'll paste that token just like that. So we run that, it sets it up. I'm going to go up, and then we're going to run that caller identity again, and we should be the role, right? So remember what I said about activity showing up in logs. This is what you're going to look for. Assume role, so the name of the role, and then your role session, which is example. All right, so I'm going to clear the screen, and then let's look at our credentials file. And now you see we have the AWS session token in here, as well as the roles access key ID and secret access key. So we'll exit out of that. And like I said before, roles have permissions assigned to them. So we can run similar commands, and we'll do list. So before we did like list user policies, because we had a user. Now we have a role, so we're going to do list role policies. And then the role name, which was user. Or nope, the role name is actually role. List role policies. Oh, so when I set up this this role, I didn't actually give it permissions to be able to. So all of these are actions that we can perform, and so I did not give the role the ability to list its role policies and read that. So let me go ahead and go fix that. Okay, so we're back. I'm going to clear the screen here. Let's run that command again. We should be able to see, okay, so we have no inline policies this time, unlike our user did. Let's see if we have any attached. So it's going to be attached instead of user policies. It's going to be role policies, and then our role name is role. Okay. So we can see that, all right, so we've got some different policies attached, IAM read-only access. That's what's allowing me now to actually be able to show you this information. And then we can apparently read S3. Both of these are AWS managed policies, so out-of-the-box policies. All right, and if we want to read those policies, we can do git policy version, policy arn. We'll do the S3, copy that. And then I'm not going to specify the version ID. It'll just be the, oh, it does need that. Okay. Version ID. So we need that version ID. So, okay. AWS IAM, get policy, and then policy arn. Paste that. The version ID we see is v3. So let's run that command again. Version ID v3. All right, so now we can see this is all of the permissions that this policy in particular gives this role. So we can do S3 list, get. So if I were to run S3 list, I don't have any buckets, but otherwise I can do that. If I wanted to do like AWS S3 remove, you'll have to specify the paths and everything, but yeah, otherwise I would be denied access to some these other permissions. Okay, so I'm going to clear the screen now, and now what we're going to do is we are going to go back and configure the user. And I'm going to show you why, because this is going to lead to an error message, and this is one that's pretty common that I hear people like, you know, they ask me like, hey, how do I fix this? And this is why, right? So AWS configure, I set up the IAM user this time. Now, if I wanted to go ahead and see who I was, I should be the user, right? But we're going to get this error message, invalid client token ID, right? The security token included in the request is invalid. Similar error message that we got before. So let's go into our credentials file and look at this. The session token is still there. Now, if you remember, the session token is only for IAM roles and not users. So we could delete this. I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out for now. It'll be the same thing. And then if we run this command again, we're going to be the user. All right, so that's how you solve that particular error. All right, so if we clear the screen, let's go ahead and talk about profiles. All right, so profiles allow us to save multiple credentials for users and roles within our account or within multiple accounts. So this is a great way of specifying a profile to direct, okay, I want to use these credentials for this particular user in this particular account. It's a great way of being able to differentiate your privileges or your users or accounts. So let's go ahead and see how we set that up. So we're going to do AWS, and this time we'll do -- profile, and then I'll call this, user, and then we will do configure. All right, so notice that we don't have the access key showing up there anymore. That's because we're no longer doing a default profile. We're specifying a new profile called user. So let me grab the access keys again, and we'll paste these, and paste the secret access key. And then likewise, my region name is different. Look, I'll even do this. I'll show you what this does. West 2, and then we'll leave that blank. Now that we have a profile set up, every time we want to run a command, we'll have to specify that profile when we want to use those credentials. Otherwise, AWS will fall back to that default profile. Now, right now, our default profile and our user profile have the same credentials. But let's go ahead and look at that AWS config file. All right, so we have the default profile, and then we have the user profile, and then look, the region is different because I specified that default region for this profile. So just wanted to show you that this file does change. All right, so now we can go back and do profile, and we can do user, and we'll do sts get caller identity, and that will tell us who we are. We are, in fact, the user. Now let's say that we wanted to configure a profile for the role. Well, in this case, we can do profile, and we can call it role. You can call it whatever you want, actually. I'm just going to call it role just to make it easy and clear for the demo. And then configure. And we'll set up the access key ID, which we don't have because we have to assume, we have to assume the role, and I thought I copied it into my notes, but I did not. So profile, we'll do user, and then we can do sts. We'll assume that role again, assume role. The role ARN is going to be this right here. And then our role session name, role. Okay, now we get credentials. Now we can do AWS -- profile, role, configure, and then copy this access key. And then we can do profile role, and then again, sts configure, set AWS session token, copy this token. All right, I made a typo. AWS profile role. Oh, we need to get rid of sts. There we go. All right, profile role, sts gets caller identity, and then we're going to be the role. All right, so if we go back and we look at our credentials file, we can see that we do have the default user. We do have a profile called user, which is just our IAM user, and then we have a role, which is the permissions associated for, the credentials associated for the role. All right, everyone, so that should get you up and running with the AWS CLI. I highly encourage you to play around with it and see what you can do, because you can definitely automate a lot of things when you're using these CLI commands. You can also throw it into a bash script and automate it even more. So thanks for watching.